In this short video, we will consider the idea of planned and intentional communities, what they are and what they mean. Most communities that are just kind of in existence have evolved in sort of an organic and unplanned way, and the development process has not been orchestrated, certainly not by a facilitator, so they've not typically followed a community development plan, but instead have simply resulted from community action and agency. So a planned community is different in that even before the community is built, there is a development plan in place, and usually it's one that's executed by some kind of experts, whether they be contractors, developers, or corporate workers. And we'll see some examples of that in just a minute. But the question is, one of the guiding questions in this video is going to be, if you build it, will they come? And of course, even if they come, will they be a community? Those are two related questions, I guess. One of the first attempts at making a planned community was Levittown, and actually there's more than one Levittown in the United States, as this model was reproduced a couple times. I know you can find one in Long Island, New York, another one in Pennsylvania. I think there's one in New Jersey, if I'm not mistaken. But essentially it was the first large-scale attempt to create a whole community. And the first one was the one on Long Island. And this large-scale community project was built by Levitt and Sons and became a model not only of planned community but also of suburbs. And today there's quite a few more suburbs than the Levittown examples, but many of the suburbs have followed a similar plan in terms of trying to become self-contained units, and we'll look at some examples of that in a moment. It's worth noting that in the case of Levittown, that there was a racial crisis that followed as the community developed over time, and this lack of inclusivity wound up being a devastating factor that undermined the community, and it was largely driven by the desire of white people to retain control of the community. And as minorities moved in, seeking to enjoy this new suburban lifestyle, whites began to flee, creating this white flight phenomenon that already characterized many of the cities from which people were leaving to come to Levittown. More recently in New Jersey was another broad-based planned community called Twin Rivers, about which Keller wrote in published in 2004 her analysis of that, and actually his research that spanned several decades. And we call this the first planned unit development, and it was emphasizing townhouses rather than freestanding residential homes. And if you read Keller's analysis of this community, you'll see how things change over this period of time, and as the residents really struggle with this notion of developing community from scratch. And of course, the first stage is dominated largely by the developers who built the community, and residents who over time wish to grow more and more independent of the influence of the developers. And eventually this transitions into a type of self-governance. The residents create dues, and not necessarily dues, but a homeowners association and a set of rules to govern themselves. Another great example of a planned community is Celebration Disney, which to a large extent takes the magic of the Disney theme parks and tries to create it in a residential setting. So essentially it becomes a theme park that you can move right into and enjoy all the amenities that a theme park offers. But the experience of living in Celebration is an empirical question. Perhaps people enjoy the amenities, but a lot of the research, such as that by Bartling from 2004, suggests that there are some tensions and that some of the residents wish they had more control over their community. And Bartling argues that what we're seeing is a community as commodity concept, where people are being sold this idea of living in a community, And that raises another empirical question. Can you actually buy your way into a community? And really that's an open-ended question. Certainly early indications are that it's not really something you can buy. It's something that has to be developed. So in the case of Celebration Disney, what we have is a development corporation, which is Disney itself, that manages and runs the communities and the community amenities. And anybody who's ever been to a Disney theme park probably knows this corporation's pretty good at keeping the trash picked up and making sure everything looks great in terms of appearances. But the residents at Celebration, it's been discovered through research, have voiced dissent a few times. For instance, starting their own newsletter to give voice to their dissent, and this was eventually suppressed by Disney. And major concerns with schooling issues were voiced, for instance, and dissatisfaction with input in terms of how the community is being governed, and the lack of a sense of community. So essentially a lot of residents felt like this was a pseudo-community, a place that looked and felt like a community, but didn't really have citizen or resident involvement. Of course, Celebration Disney isn't a unique experiment, and several ambitious developers have tried to create so-called self-contained gated communities, and the idea here is not just to provide people with a neighborhood, but also to give them a place to go shopping, to get something to eat, to go to school, to go see the doctor, and maybe even to give them a place to work without ever leaving the gated community. And of course, there are critics of this model. For one, gated communities tend to house only the affluent, and if the affluent are keeping all these community institutions to themselves, it leaves a lot less of their resources available for low-income residents to perhaps have a higher quality school or hospital or other types of amenities. That also could be extended out to things like parks. So an example of that would be Lakewood Ranch, which you can find near Sarasota, Florida. Other planned communities have a more targeted focus, such as retirement communities, which are planned communities designed to house and support the elderly. And many of these retirement communities, much like gated communities, are completely self-contained and have some similarities to Celebration Disney and so forth. And the idea is to provide enhanced amenities that were built with the elderly in mind and meeting their special needs. So ultimately, this idea of planned and intentional communities has its roots in utopian thinking, and that traces all the way back to Thomas More, who actually coined the term utopia, an idea based on the perfect or idealized community that is set apart from the rest. And out of More's idea came several experiments. In the 19th century, many utopian societies emerged as intentional communities and were typically based on religious movements, such as perhaps the Amish, who have created their own separate communities where they can practice their religious beliefs among themselves, right? And in more utopian societies emerged in the 20th century, but were less likely to be based on religion and more likely to be based on alternative lifestyles such as the hippie lifestyle. So as we reflect on planned communities, here are a few questions that I'll leave you with. One is, are planned or intentional communities real communities? Are they inclusive? What could they do to be more inclusive? What would be the view of such communities from the different theoretical perspectives that we've discussed, or different approaches to community development? I'll give you a hint right there. Many of these are driven almost entirely by technical assistance, focused on the outcome rather than the process. So then another question is, can life in the ideal community be bought? This idea that Bartlett points to, that it's community as a commodity, community for sale. Is that even feasible? And can it be attained? A few more questions are, can a community be effectively managed like a corporation? And can they even be managed by a corporation, as in the case of Celebration Disney? How can planned communities make the transition to being more democratic and perhaps resolve some of the tensions we saw in the case of Celebration. This, of course, all cuts to the key questions: what is a community? And to the developers and the corporations that create planned communities, they usually have a very physical, material view. That if we build roads and infrastructure, we put in houses and buildings, we've got a community. But the reality is, community is much more than the physical component, right? A big part of community has to do with social interaction. And that's something that is often neglected or downplayed. So another final question is, how do the community capitals work out in terms of a planned community? Are there any advantages? And I would think that in terms of planning, in terms of the built infrastructure, for instance, that having a planned community could be a good thing. As more intelligent forms of transportation are installed, as more effective and efficient ways of delivering water or electricity or internet are devised, there are some real potential gains here. But what are the trade-offs in terms of the social, political, cultural capital?